Sorry, it's like technical glitch, but I'm here now as your chair of this session, and thank you everyone who is joining, has joined, and will join. Are we ready to go?
Yeah, I think so.
I think the general format has been that the presenters will give their presentations, and then afterwards we'll have more time for talking and questions at the end, if that suits. I'm happy to have a different format, but that's the one that I suggest because the papers themselves look like we could make some pretty good connections between the presenters and the topics. So let's follow that path unless there's some objections. Now, from the program, to me, it's not clear exactly who or whether everybody will be presenting the papers on which they're named. And so we can just make it a bit more organic and move through. There may be one presenter presenting on behalf of a number of authors or not, as the case may be, but we can work it out and enjoy this very interesting looking session that has 3 papers. And after which we'll have some questions. So thank you for being here, all of the audience and the presenters. Now, the first paper is presented by Hayden, Blaine and Chris Thompson. Will you both be speaking together, or how will that work? Will I just hand over to you to share this session now?
Yeah, thanks. We'll do a bit each.
Good.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, the abstracts and the bios are in our program. I don't want to spend our time introducing people, except to say that this is especially all of the papers, but this one, as it relates to Christchurch and its earthquake stories, is a particularly important reference point for the development of digital humanities in New Zealand over that period of time and the contribution that it's made. So I look forward personally to this paper and welcome you now to speak. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll just share my screen, share the whole thing. Okay, so hello everyone. I'm Hayden Blaine from the University of Canterbury, and today I'll be presenting with my colleague Chris Thompson about this topic of the evolution of community discourses in Cantabrians' reiterated earthquake stories. And we'll be looking at, specifically Chris's section will be looking at topic modeling, and my section will be looking at positioning analysis and how these approaches can kind of be combined or synergized to try and answer our research questions. So the talk today, I'll first give a bit of a background of the earthquakes and also how all the data was collected, and talk about our research aims. And then I'll switch over to Chris in section 3 to talk about what topic modeling is and the kind of results we got from the topic model that Chris developed and ran. I'll then come back to me to talk about positioning analysis, what it is, and the kind of things we can get from that, and then finish up with just a summary and a bit of talk about our planned future work. So we're talking about narratives of the Canterbury earthquakes in this talk. So these are, for those who aren't familiar, these are the earthquakes that occurred in 2010 and 2011. And were very significant partly because they occurred in Christchurch with a high population density. During that time, 185 lives were lost, 80% of the central city was lost, and 7,800 homes were zoned uninhabitable. So as you can imagine, there was a lot of kind of population displacement, kind of refugees from Christchurch going to other parts of New Zealand, and just a lot of rebuild and recovery that was needed during this time. And even though I haven't arrived in Christchurch yet, from the research that I've done, the discussions that I've had with everyone, there's still a lot of recovery still happening. In response to this, the University of Canterbury developed this Quake box project, which, as you can see in the picture here, is essentially a mobile shipping container that got brought around to different locations in Christchurch where the project team invited people to come in and tell their stories about their earthquake experience. So in 2012, the team collected approximately 720 spoken narratives of people's earthquake experiences. And then again, in 2019 and 2020, the team received further funding to collect retold stories by the same participants. So invitations were sent out and approximately 120 participants returned to retell their earthquake stories and also tell their stories of what had happened since. So we have this kind of special corpus of retold stories about earthquake experiences here. Is there someone in the chat? Yes, thank you. So why are we looking at retold narratives? So on the right here, I've just got a picture of one of the participants who telling their story in 2012 and then telling their story again in 2019. As you can see, there's a bit of, it seems like they have changed a bit, and the story itself, just from the subtitles, has also evolved somewhat. So scholars from a range of fields, from psychology to linguistics to conversation analysis, have all kind of focused in on how important retold narratives can be in trying to understand self and identity, human behavior, and kind of society more generally. So in psychology, Habermas and Berger have shown how by analyzing retold stories, the people whose stories shifted to become told in a more positive light or in a more kind of what they consider to be a coherent way correlate with how they had better coped with emotional experiences. Schifrin has showed how retold stories indicate how narrative structure changes over time, and Norick has looked at how a story kernel emerges in conversational stories. So when a story is told, the ones he looked at, the story is retold in a space of just about 30 minutes, 3 times. The story itself remains the same, but is just different parts are put in different positions of the story in order to fit the kind of interactional needs of the moment. And lastly, narrative psychologists like Bamberg have used retold narratives to look at how identity and self develop over time. And this is the kind of approach that I'll be looking at today. The reason we're looking at discourses of community specifically, at least in this paper, is because community resilience is kind of a key concept in post-disaster studies of how communities can recover and bounce back from disasters. And yet post-disaster communities are also prime locations for what Marcanese calls, or drawing on Foucault, biopolitical discourses, where this kind of heterogeneous discourse is circulating in society in an attempt to potentially discipline certain communities. I won't be going into that too much today, but the main point is that there's kind of constant circulation of discourses happening, which can impact the evolution of a community as it's recovering from disaster. So here's 2 examples of what people think about this concept of community resilience. So one participant said, I think we're resilient rather unproblematically. And another participant said, if someone says the word resilient to me again, I will just effing scream. So anyone here who experienced the earthquakes themselves and the kind of recovery process might be able to relate to these ideas. So we have 2 main research aims. The first is to understand how discourses of community evolve in the wake of natural disasters. And this is to kind of get a better sense of what communities do in order to position themselves as subjects within this kind of discourse of community as they tell their stories of earthquake experience. The second research aim is more methodological, and it's to evaluate the feasibility of topic modeling as an approach to the discourse analysis of longitudinal corpora of transcribed spoken narratives. So this is a bit wordy, but topic modeling has been applied to discourse analysis before, but typically with newspaper articles. And so applying this to transcribed spoken narratives can show us how spoken data can also be appropriately analyzed with topic modeling. But also the key part here is the longitudinal corpora, so 2 sets of corpora separated by a significant period of time. Topic modeling can potentially give us an insight into some sort of topic or discourse evolution. So I'll now hand over to Chris to talk about topic modeling.
Okay, thanks, Hayden. So we've, for this, used latent Dirichlet allocation, or LDA topic modeling, which is probably the most widely used algorithm and is kind of a baseline that other variants of topic modeling are compared to. It's an unsupervised machine learning algorithm. It proposes the existence of latent topics which combine in variable mixtures to produce the documents that we observe in a collection. LDA is a generative model that aims to infer these latent topics using a probabilistic process that looks at 2 measures, really. It looks at a distribution of topics within documents and a distribution of words within topics. And these 2 measures force the model to find a compromise between the specific mixtures of topics found in particular documents with the way that those words tend to group across the corpus as a whole. While there's a large computer science literature on LDA and its variants, much less has been done to connect it with the qualitative analysis of texts. But there is some work existing already on its relation to discourse analysis. So Brooks and McInerney, for example, found that topic models have limited use for identifying discourse patterns when they use them to study NHS patient data. But others have found that topic models, or topics rather, can be conceptualized as discursive elements or as related to discursive elements. And most importantly, it's argued that the relationality of meaning observed in topic models make it suitable to assist with discourse analysis. When a topic model is well tuned to the data and the research question, words used in different semantic contexts, for example, tend to be found in different topics, and we can thus see a kind of semantic network of a kind between topics in a model. And of course, if we want to observe experiences or changes, sort of collective changes between our 2 subcorpora, then we want ways to measure that across our whole corpus of texts rather than just in particular examples. Okay. So here's what topics extracted from our Quake box corpus look like in one instance with 10 topics. We've started with a fairly minimal approach to pre-processing our text, since we're also interested in narrative structure and in a variety of things to do with the way that participants told their stories. So we've kept quite a lot of tokens. There are some speech disfluencies and so on in these lists that we may remove in future. And we've experimented with a variety of different size models. There are a number of quantitative coherence measures that can be used to evaluate the topic word lists, but we've tended to fall back on qualitative analysis of lists of words and topics in line with findings of studies such as that by Chang Chang et al. In 2009 that argue that quantitative measures don't always line up very well with human evaluation of what a topic is. In general, we could say that topic modeling is a bit like the zoom on a camera. Different pre-processing and model parameters give you a different view of the corpus, and there isn't really a natural or correct number of topics as such. That said, these lists give us something to start with in thinking about different types of community or talk about aspects of community that are present in the corpus. Okay, thanks, Hayden. So we want to know, one thing we want to know is how the topics in their retellings in Quake Box 2 and those stories, how they differ from the first story for each participant. And so this heat map is an attempt at that, which shows the difference between each participant's first and second stories. So it's based on the difference in proportion of a topic present in the first and the second telling, and it gives us some indication of areas where large changes occur. However, this isn't a very satisfactory measure, since it doesn't tell us about the direction of the change, and it doesn't attempt to account for document length, which varies a lot. The documents are different between the two subcorpora. So on average, the first set of stories was around 800 words, the transcript of those stories, while with the retelling, they tend to be quite a bit longer, around 1,300 words. When we were interviewing participants and for the Quake Box 2 retelling interviews, our research team tried to ensure that the participants would have every opportunity to tell their story in a way that was similar to the first story. But of course, there are some unavoidable differences in the situation and the expectation of participants coming to do a retelling. Even the prompt to please remind us of your earthquake story, which was the way we opened those sessions, in the context of a research project where people have made considerable effort to come and participate a second time, is quite different from the way that stories were collected in Quake Box 1, where we had our recording studio on the side of the street and people could just walk in. So we drew on work by Marjanan et al., who studied applied topic models to historical newspaper collections, and they had developed a topic prominence measure. They compute the prominence of a topic in a given year by summing up the contribution to that topic for each document in that year, and then normalizing that by the sum of all the contributions for a given year. So we're doing a similar thing, but within our two subcorpora. So this chart shows for each topic, we've taken the proportion of that topic in the Quake Box 1 story from a model that's trained on all of the stories. And then that's normalized against the proportion of that topic in the corpus as a whole, giving us a percentage for each topic, sort of showing how different topics maybe are more prevalent in the first and second set of stories. There were three kind of community-related sets of topics here that we picked out of this particular model. So one about teachers and children and picking up children from school. One about more about the city of Christchurch in a more abstract sense, and one topic 7 that's more to do with kind of rebuilding and repairs and insurance claims. So this measure gives us a way to evaluate the change by topic for each subcorpus. We have found that it's quite sensitive to pre-processing and changing model parameters. And it's also useful for looking topic by topic, but we can't necessarily compare, say topic 5 with topic 6 directly, because the documents are different lengths, and so the proportions relate to sort of different amounts of the corpus, and topics themselves are asymmetric. That is, some topics make up more of the corpus than others, and that's a natural, that's something that we want. Okay. And then the last slide. So we've also compared individual participants' topic profiles for each of their stories. So this allows us to look at an individual and their two stories and identify where the greatest change is in terms of topics between those two tellings. We know topics 0, 1, and 7 in this model have some bearing on community, as I've just noted. And we can see this participant, for example, talks hardly at all about topic 0, whereas topic 1 and topic 7, they show an increase, something of an increase. And this has been useful. This is consistent with our observations about an increase in talking about community in more abstract ways in QB2. And we can also confirm looking at this participant that, it's someone who doesn't have young children, so they don't talk about the schools topic. The next stage of our project will involve analysing more of these contrasting cases and using topic models as a rough guide to discourse features of interest. Hayden.
Hey, thanks, Chris. So in order to kind of find a way to synthesize this topic model, which provides kind of exploratory and machine learning, probabilistic, data-driven way of the kind of discourses that seem to be going on in the corpus, we're trying to use positioning analysis to really zoom down and see what is happening at the micro level in these stories, especially, as we'll talk about today, stories which seem to be essentially about the exact same events. So I'll be drawing on positioning analysis, which is a form of narrative analysis developed by Bamberg in 1997, and it was partly developed in response to structural narrative analysis, specifically by Lebov and Waletsky. So Lebov and Waletsky focused or privileged form over function in an attempt to kind of delineate what a narrative genre was, just based purely on linguistic structure. In contrast, Bamberg and others who follow this positioning analysis methodology they privilege function over form and look at what kind of functions narratives have in interaction, but also what kind of functions the narratives might have in relation to producing or reproducing people's identities in talk. So Bamberg suggests looking at 3 levels of positioning. The first one being positioning level 1, where it is the tale world. So looking at what is going on in the story itself, where the characters position themselves to other characters. And he does this by using a kind of linguistic analysis, for example, looking at where certain figures are placed as subjects or objects and their kind of relationships between those subjects and objects and other figures in the story. The second level moves back slightly to the teller world. So this refers to the world between the teller and the audience or the listener. So this is kind of using a more conversation analytic interactional analysis to observe how the teller position themselves in relation to an audience, specifically referring to things like teller rights, so the rights to tell the story and how they produce those rights to tell the story in the specific interactional context. Finally, taking the biggest step back to positioning level 3, looking at this idea of the discourse world. So this is how the storyteller position themselves in relation to larger circulating discourses, such as varying discourses of community. So I'm just going to give everyone, this is the transcript of one participant, James David Bundy, who was a participant that Chris showed before in that previous slide. So the positioning analysis can kind of follow something like this, where I'll be looking at positioning level 1 and 2, specifically on these lines 3, 4, and 5. So on line 3, in the QB1 story, James says, and I felt that even though I was keen to get back to Littleton, I couldn't not go and see how they were. Sorry, just a bit of context. This is a story where he's talking about he was trying to get back home to Littleton right after the February earthquake happened. But then on the way, he stopped to help some people who he knew, and he saw that their house was kind of in a bit of a state of ruin. So he says, I couldn't not go. This kind of double negative obligatory modal indicates that he's positioning his character as kind of being pushed by some sort of external forces to go and help those immediately around him, even though he was keen to get back to Littleton. In line 4, he continues, so I went in and things were in a bit of a bad state, really. So again, we see this, things were in a bit of a bad state. He's modulating the description of the house to kind of downplay the seriousness of this state of ruin that the house was in. In line 5, he kind of continues with this. Part of the house had come down, the bricks had come down, the oven door had come off, and this kind of somewhat objective description of the state of the house is again downplaying the seriousness of the ruin as if to say that his part in helping them isn't necessarily something super heroic, but is just kind of something that everyone in this situation would be doing. Fast forward 7 years in the QB2 story, when he's retelling the same story. And interestingly, he retells the same story in almost the exact same sequence of events. So in line 3 for the QB2 story, he changes and says, even though I was keen to get back to Littleton, I knew my wife was okay somehow, but I'm still keen to get back there. I had to go into the old friend's house. So here he brackets the need to go in and help the old friends with, I knew my wife was okay somehow, kind of positioning himself now as someone who has this kind of responsibilities as a husband to help his family. And interestingly, instead of where in QB1, he referred to the two people just as Joyce and Len Cohen, and in line 2 as just an old couple. In line 3 in the QB2 story, he refers to them as old friends. Again, emphasizing this positioning of friends rather than just people who you know, as people who are part of the community who you need to help. In line 4, he says, and that was a real schmozzle. So again, this description is changing to become somewhat more dramatizing the state of the house. And this continues, everything was on the floor, the chimney was down, the oven door, the lifter oven door, it was stuck in the ceiling. So using this extreme case formulation here, everything was on the floor, kind of more hyperbolic. And then this visualization of this oven door somehow flying off and being stuck in the ceiling. And in the story itself, he uses a gesture here, which doesn't exist in the first story, to kind of paint this picture for the audience of the kind of dramatic scene of what was going on. So drawing on these kind of positioning level 1 and 2 interpretations, taking a step back to level 3, we can arguably see a shift from this physical locational sense of community to a more abstract familial sense of community. So in 2012, James seemed to position himself as someone who needed to prioritize helping nearby community members, even if it meant not immediately going to see his wife, and also downplaying the kind of personal sacrifice that was involved in doing this. In contrast, in 2019, his bracketing of the helping with knowing that his wife was okay somehow indicates that there's this more social expectation and social norm that family should be at the front of one's mind post-disaster. And again, by emphasizing the state of ruin of the house and his own position in helping the friends, there's kind of an emphasis on the personal sacrifice that was involved in doing this. So just to kind of relate what we've talked about so far back to our original research aims, our first aim was to understand how discourses and subjectivities of community evolve in the wake of natural disasters. And we've tried to do this by using the topic model in a variety of scales. So going from the whole corpus to the 2 subcorpora of QB1 and QB2, and then down to individual documents to identify this shift in community-oriented topics. Kind of bouncing off this, the positioning analysis then shows how these shifts are operationalized even in the telling of almost identical stories. So even though the events were the same, the way that the story is told in the 2 situations seems to indicate some sort of discursive shift. And so we suggest that in the wake of immediate disaster, in the immediate wake of disaster, tellers seem to position themselves within this discourse of prioritizing physical community, the community that's immediately around you. While 7 years on, tellers like James position themselves within discourses of abstract communities, of kind of these mental communities of family and friends. Those are the people who should be trying to help more. And the second aim was the more methodological one of evaluating the feasibility of topic modeling for this to answer these kinds of research questions. And we suggest that for the purpose of identifying longitudinal change in topics, topic modeling does seem to be a feasible approach, as the kind of scalar levels can indicate change from one corpus to another. And the positioning analysis showed that these topics seem to be related to discursive elements. Okay, and just our final slide, we just want to talk about some future work that we're planning to do as soon as we can, really. So first, we want to try and run a correlated topic model to look at the relationality of meaning, the relationality of different terms like community, and how they're used differently from QB1 and QB2 to be indicators of shifting discourses. We want to do further comparisons between models with different features, such as models that are rich in these kind of interactional tokens like or models that have those taken away. And then I'm really interested to run topic models on extracted February earthquake experience sub-narratives. So the models we've run so far have been on the entire story that was recorded. Some of these are over an hour long, but I think it would be interesting to see what happens when we extract these moments when people are talking specifically about one experience, to kind of help normalize the model in some way, but also to zoom in on how people dealt specifically with these particular experiences. Okay, there's some references, and thanks everyone for listening.
Thank you. Can you hear me at the moment? Oh, I got a message saying, sorry, that the host wasn't allowing me to unmute, which is just a technical glitch. Thank you so much for that beautiful presentation. And it was just fascinating. And we've got questions in the chat, but we'll save them and a comment, including fascinating, which is a very good endorsement of your presentation so far, but we'll save those comments and questions till later, and we're just running to time. So let's move on, if we can, to the next presentation, which I'm going to pronounce this completely wrongly, I'm sure, towards an electronic reference grammar of aaDH. Now, I know that I've got that wrong, but I do know that it's a Papuan language, which is, you know, this is one of the most important applications of digital humanities that we can really imagine to endangered languages and understanding minority languages for their preservation and future. So I'd like to hand over to the presenters of this paper. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Paul. You actually pronounced that just right. It's aaDH, so no worries. So hi, everyone. My name is Dineke, and I'll be talking about our work today. So I'll just share my screen with you so you guys can see my presentation. There we go. And there we go. So hopefully that's visible to everyone. And I also shared my sound, so that's good. So this work is following from some stuff that I've been doing together with Robert Fromont, who's also in this session, and Gia Hurring, on a pilot project developing an electronic reference grammar of aaDH. So firstly, I'll just give you a brief introduction of the aaDH language in a bit, and after that, I'll be talking a bit about why we think that electronic reference grammars are important, and also what reference grammars actually are, and why we wanted to do this project. And I will then sort of give an overview on what we've done so far, and it's going to be a short presentation, so it will only be a very brief sort of overview, but happy to take questions afterwards. So yeah, aaDH is spoken in Papua New Guinea. It's a Papuan language. It's the language of the Diblak tribe living in Western Province in Papua New Guinea, as you can see on the map here. And aaDH is a very vital language. It's used in all domains of life. It's being passed on to children. This part of Papua New Guinea is actually really lingual, and it's really normal for people to speak like 4, 5, or even more local indigenous languages fluently. And for most of the languages in this region, at least on the Papua New Guinea side of the border, there isn't there isn't any indication of a shift happening to one of the lingua francas that came in during colonial times, like Tok Pisin or English. And I worked with the ED speaking community during my postdoc at the Australian National University on documenting their language. And pictured here on the left with me is the ED, local ED language committee. So why do we want to do this work? Well, most of you, I know that some of you are linguists, but maybe not all of you are. So I'll just say a few words about reference grammars. So basically, these are systematic descriptions of the structure of a language. So they can be very comprehensive, going from sound systems to what types of words we find in the language, to how words and sentences and higher, like sort of larger chunks of speech are organized. And there are more than 7,000 languages spoken around the world, and they show an incredible amount of diversity. But as also is well known, unfortunately, the majority of them is actually endangered nowadays, especially those that are spoken by smaller indigenous groups. And grammars form an important part an important element within the language documentation and revitalization enterprise, besides, of course, other elements as well. So traditionally, reference grammars would have the form of a book, so like a linear static description. But it's been recognized for quite a long time that they have these resources have some drawbacks, both from an academic perspective, also from a community of language learners and users perspective. So some of the issues, for instance, are the fact that there is no possibility to sort of update a book, right? Once it's out, it's out, and you can't sort of easily add or change information that is in the resource. Also, there is limited integration between the description and the corpus that it's based on. So most reference grammars that are published nowadays are based on a corpus. But it's often like, for instance, examples in the reference grammar aren't clickable and playable, so people can actually hear the recording that the example is based on. And then there is also things like, especially when these grammars are published with academic publishers, that there will be a hefty price tag, and that makes them inaccessible to like a large proportion of their potential users. So we have been working on a pilot project to develop a prototype of an electronic reference grammar, so an e-grammar, based on the existing corpus of ED language recordings that I collected. And we believe that having this more accessible way of representing language data would have multiple benefits, both also for the communities of speakers themselves. So having better access to for communities to their own language data is in line with the FAIR principle of open indigenous data. So that FAIR acronym stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So it will be easier for communities to find and access data in this electronic format potentially. But of course, this increasing accessibility also comes with a risk, that of potential misuse by third parties, for instance. And for that reason, we are also committed to carrying out this development of the e-grammar under the CARE principles that are also part of this framework. So that acronym stands for collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics. So the work, we want to do this work responsibly and in line with the wishes and the values of the ED speaking community. So just to stress, at the moment, this is still in a prototype format. This is still a pilot project. So nobody except us has access to this data, and it won't be made available with unrestricted open access before I have done some further community consultation, and the community wishes, of course, will be principal in determining the type of access eventually that would be appropriate. So let's just have a look at, so this is what the homepage, the Corpus homepage looks like at the moment. So as a first step in our project, this existing corpus of aaDH that I collected was uploaded to LabCat. That's a corpus management tool developed by within the NZILBB at the University of Canterbury by Robert Fromont and Jen Hay. And this tool has been used widely already to manage and research corpora of New Zealand English, particularly like the Onze and also the Quake box corpus that Hayden and Chris were talking about just before. Also corpora of Tereo and, for instance, also German are in there. And so LabCat is open source software, but it's important to note that this is only relevant sort of for the software overarching software architecture. And it doesn't mean that any corpora or any language specific data in the tool are necessarily open access. That's quite the contrary. LabCat is purposefully designed so that you can have very specific access settings for each corpus and even individual speakers or recordings within each corpus. This is just a screenshot of the homepage. I will play you a little video in a moment to sort of demonstrate some of the functionality that we have now. So this is just the workflow before all of the LabCat adaptation happened. So it's sort of a very standard workflow in language documentation. So recordings were made and transcribed locally by with the help of native speaker consultants and assistants. Transcribed in ELAN, then glossing, interlinearized glossing was added with Flex. Then from Flex, things were back imported into ELAN to create like this tier structure. And then this was imported or uploaded into LabCat. And Robert made some adjustments to the existing architecture of LabCat so that it could accommodate these this slightly differing structure from what was already in there before. So for the current functionality, I have actually made a little video to demonstrate this. I thought that would be sort of the smoothest way of doing this, hopefully. So I'll play this video for you. Hopefully the sound is working. That's just me, a video screen capture of me demonstrating some of the things in the corpus. So here we go. Oh, I have 3 minutes left. The video is actually 5. Is that okay? I don't know if it's playing right now. So this small video is going to demonstrate some of the functionality of the current aaDH corpus. So this is the homepage that I have just shown you before of what the aaDH corpus looks like in LabCat. So as you can see, there are some basic statistics here, number of transcripts and the number of word tokens. When you go to statistics, you can find some more statistics. But that is not what I wanted to show you today. So firstly, I just wanted to show you how a particular recording, what that looks like. And then I'll show you the new module, the documentation module that can be found via the link here. So a list of transcripts can be found via the link here. And it basically looks like this. So this is just a list of all the transcripts that are currently in the corpus, and you can just select any of them. And then a particular transcript, for instance, will look like this. So here we find all the layers. So these were imported from the ELAN file and have the names that the tiers in the ELAN file had. And if you go down, we can see that it looks like this. So the English is on top at the moment, the English free translation. Then we have the aaDH, we have the word-by-word glosses. And then here we have the aaDH words and also the aaDH words broken down by morpheme by morpheme. And on the right-hand side here, we have have a video if that's available for that particular recording, and the sound file, which is playable. So I'll just play you a little bit to see what, so you can hear and see what it is like.
Spelling galan. Kwanzi wapa batkon kumblabi. Bojin am dagin wo bojin. Jaren paklabu prima gegebine.
So as you can see, the video has subtitles that are taken from the transcript here, the ED words, and there is this gray bit that goes through the transcript. So it's very easy to follow along with the recordings. And then, so the last thing I would like to show you is the documentation functionality as we have built it up until now. So that's under the link here. So when we go there, we find that there is some general information about the ED language on the first page, and then on the left-hand side there is a little menu. So it is built like a wiki kind of thing, where you can add in hyperlinks to as many pages as you like. However, this is only available to admins, and not members of the public, so it's not like anyone can just add information. And then the menu will lead you through it. So for instance, when you go to phonology in the menu, you go to segmental phonology, you can, for instance, find a consonant inventory of ED. As I said, you can add in hyperlinks into the text. So for instance, we go to morphology. There is the word noun here is a hyperlink. So when you click on that, you get more information still to be added about nouns in the ED language. And the really cool thing is that we have links to the corpus here. So any example that is inserted in the grammatical description, like for instance, these two examples here for nominal morphology, they are playable. So when I click on the play button here, it plays the example that is put in there to illustrate the description. And there are also links between the examples and the corpus. So when I click on any of the words here in this example, a new tab opens, and that takes me straight to this particular recording, annotated recording in the corpus. So here I can listen to, as a reader, I can listen to the example and look at the example in context of the original recording. So that is some of the functionality that we have in there right now. Yes, so that's basically all I wanted to tell you at the moment. So of course we have quite a few things on the wish list still. So we still want to extend this functionality to also include links from elements back to in the corpus back to the grammar, have a feedback function, have a tagging function, having a dictionary module added would be really good as well. And because of course a lot of the users in these smaller communities basically mostly have internet access through smartphones, it would also be very helpful to have a version of this that works well on a small screen. So that's it from me for now, and yeah, happy to take questions later during the question time. Thank you.
Thank you very much for fascinating presentation. It's just so much to think about, and excellent work. And there will be time for questions later, but in the interests of keeping to our schedule, we should move now to the third presentation, which is on the topic of expanding the user community of scholarship, language description as an example, from Simon Musgrave and Nick Thieberger. Thank you very much to our presenters.
Thank you, Paul. Nick sends his apologies. He can't be with us today, so I'm presenting this work. And I'd like to say that I'm talking to you from the unceded lands of the Bonorong people of the Kulin Nation, and I acknowledge their elders past and present and emerging. I'll just share my screen. So it's actually really exciting to be giving this presentation right after Dineke's presentation, because I'm going to be saying a lot of the same things. Whereas Dineke's talking about creating electronically accessible grammatical description from data collected recently with the wonderful technological capabilities we now have, what Nick and I have been working on is retrofitting these possibilities to an existing grammatical description. So we'll talk about that in some detail later, and I'll show you a little bit of what we've been doing also. But first of all, as Dineke already mentioned, in terms of grammatical description, there are barriers to access for people. There's barriers to physical access, which can do with things like, as Dineke mentioned, the cost, but also a lot of these kind of materials are held only in big research libraries. And if you want to consult them, if you're a member of a speaker community, for example, that may be really inaccessible. But there's also issues around the content that make these things very hard for non-linguists, non-specialists often to deal with. So I want to talk about that a little bit as well. And there's a particular issue with the material we've been working with in terms of just how it's formatted, which I'll come to. So what kind of things are we talking about here? As Dineke said, and I'm saying again, physical cost is a really big issue. I looked up the Mouton Grammar Library, which is one of the major series that publishes grammars from a commercial publisher. And as it happened, they had a couple of recent issues there, which were both Australian languages, Ngadi and Gurindji. And for each of those, the price is 160 euros, which is $250 Australian, 255 New Zealand. That's a lot of money. I don't know about any of you guys, but I'm not going out buying $250 books on a daily basis. So that's some kind of a problem. The material that Nick and I are working on is a grammar of a language from Arnhem Land called Ngubuyu, also known as Wuboi, which was described by the American linguist Jeffrey Heath in the 1980s. And his grammar, the actual volume that's called Grammar, Functional Grammar of Ngubuyu, according to Trove, is held by 34 institutions in Australia. 19 of those are university libraries, most of the main ones, although it's interesting that University of New South Wales and Griffith don't hold it. It's in national and state libraries, although the State Library of Western Australia is missing, and it's in a few other institutions. It's also in 5 closed collections. So there are possibilities to access this material without owning a copy, but you need to be in major population centres by and large. There were a couple that were in small places, but most of these are in capital cities of states. So again, there are barriers to access for quite a lot of people. What about the content? Well, like any academic discipline, linguistics has its specialised vocabulary, and quite a lot of what we write is not easy for non-specialists to comprehend. So here's a short excerpt from Heath's grammar, talking about aspect, which is how you view events unfolding. And if you just read through this, if you're not a linguist, you may find this fairly incomprehensible. What are the things that are being talked about here? How do they relate to anything that you actually know about? And even if, imagine you were a speaker of this language and you were reading this, you might say, well, I don't know what's going on. This doesn't make any sense in terms of my experience of using this language. And I would also point out that this is not even a problem just for purely linguistic issues. So as you would probably expect for a description of a language from Australia, Heath has quite a lot to say about kinship systems. And the language in which that's discussed is also fairly impenetrable. It's very specialised. If you've never encountered the term semi-moiety or matrifiliative, you may be left looking at this and scratching your head. So this is not necessarily a problem that electronic grammars automatically solve. But it's worth keeping in mind that these kinds of issues can bar people from accessing this material, even when they'd have a lot of interest in getting to it. I said that for Nungabuyu, there's some particular issues around formatting. So in Heath, his description uses quite complex orthography. He uses superscripts to indicate a couple of nasal sounds, palatal nasal and velar nasal. He uses subscripts to differentiate some glides. All of this takes effort to keyboard and to interpret. And he also uses underlines and consonant plus H clusters to differentiate some consonants. In like quite a number of Australian languages, Nungabuyu is extravagant in the distinctions it makes in consonant articulation between the teeth and the palate, where English, we don't care a lot about that stuff, but a lot of Australian languages make a lot of distinctions there. So Heath developed an orthography that tracked all of that, and it's quite complex. We'll see examples shortly. But since the 1980s, the community has developed their own orthography, which is more transparent. It's easier to understand. It's easier to keyboard as well. So there's an issue, if we want to make this material accessible to the community, there's an issue about, well, what orthography are you going to use, or how are you going to make it possible for people to see things in different orthographies? And that's the path we're taking. We're trying to make everything available in both orthographies. And again, I'll show you examples later. The other particular barrier that we're looking at here, and this is something that the kind of work Dineke's doing kind of avoids, because nowadays we're using everything in so much more integrated fashion. But in Heath's time, and in a tradition that goes back to the work of Franz Boas early in the 19th century, a full description of a language has at least 3 parts, and nowadays 4. And those are a collection of texts, the corpus that Dineke was talking about. There's a dictionary. What are the words and morphemes that occur in those texts? There's the grammar proper. What are the generalizations we can make about how words and morphemes are pronounced, put together, and convey meaning? And nowadays, there's also media, as Dineke has showed us, that everything is ultimately based in recordings of native speakers of the language communicating. In terms of Heath's work, we're fortunate that most of his field recordings still exist and are archived at the Australian Institute for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies in Canberra. But we are still working on getting them time aligned so that we can incorporate them in what we're doing. I'll show you one example where we have done that later. So we have these parts that are separate in some sense, and understanding what's going on in the language depends on relating them to one another. So to understand a text, you may need to look things up in the dictionary, or to look at relevant parts of the grammar which explain the structures you're looking at. But on the other hand, the dictionary entries themselves and the points in the grammar ultimately rest on parts of the text as the supporting evidence. So we're very familiar with this. If we think something, say the Oxford English Dictionary, it gives us lots of quotations that illustrate how words are used. And that's how a good dictionary should work. And that's how we want our dictionaries in language description to work as well. Dineke showed you her examples where she had examples from the corpus and how they are related to points in grammatical description. So that's another way of interlinking these different parts. And of course, as I've said, all of that ultimately depends on actual recordings. So why did we choose to work with Heath's materials? Well, the answer here is that Heath published his work as 3 separate volumes, which you can see down there. There's what's called the Functional Grammar of Nungabuyu, the volume of texts, myths and ethnographic texts, and the dictionary. These are 3 separate physical objects. And the linking between them is explicit. Heath made a conscious decision not to include actual textual examples in the grammar or in the dictionary, but only references to the volume of texts. It was a methodological decision which he justified on good grounds, and it is reflected in best current practice. He was ahead of his time. But when he made that decision, the technology wasn't really very suitable. So when you need to follow those relationships, you're juggling 3 physical volumes. And at least 2 of them are quite large. The dictionary is not so big, but the grammar and the text volume, they're 400 or 500 pages each. It's actually a kind of in-joke in linguists who study Australian languages that the grammar volume here should have been called the dysfunctional grammar of Nungabuyu. Not because it's not a good description, but because it's so hard to use for this reason. So the thinking that Nick and I had was that Heath had already conceptualized an electronic grammar. Everything's interlinked. He just didn't have the technology. So we're trying to retrofit hyperlinking web technologies to this material. As I said, he doesn't give examples in the grammar of the dictionary, but he gives explicit links. So from the grammar, the links to examples in texts. From the dictionary, there are links to examples in texts. And of course, there are internal cross-references, but they're a much less of a concern than these links between the texts and everything else. And there are some links between the dictionary and the grammar as well, but again, they're not so important. We've chosen to implement, though, links between the grammar. Any form in Nungabuyu that appears in the grammar should have a link to the dictionary if there's an entry for it. So we're trying to increase even the interlinking that Heath had thought of. As I already said, physically this means 3 separate volumes juggling on your desk. Here's what it looks like. So we've got here a little paragraph out of the grammar at the top, and you can see all these sequences of numbers. These are all references to texts. So the first one that shows there, 21.9.1, says there's an example of this in text 21, section 9, line 1. And as you can see, he gives a lot of references. In a way, you can see that this is already an improvement on actually including the example. So he's listed, what, 7 or 8 examples here. If you put those in a book, the book gets very big very quickly. So in a way, this is an economical procedure, but in terms of working with a book, it's also very inconvenient. So we can see there's one reference, there's text 43.4.3, and we can see the form that he's talking about occurs in there. And then down the bottom, we can see an entry from the dictionary, which also references this text unit 43.4.1, and there's that form, and there's the link. So that's how it works on paper, and our challenge is to try and make all of that work in a web browser. In terms of communities that this affects, this language is still spoken. Wuboy, it's got around 120 speakers, I think, at the moment. It is still being passed on to children, so it may even survive a while longer. And that means that there are people who are interested there in Heath's work, but it's not very accessible to them at the moment. They face the kind of barriers that I've already discussed. So one aspect of our work is that we hope that we will make this more accessible to them, and particularly the orthography issue may be something where we can really make a difference. So how are we going about doing this? Well, it's a 2-stage process. Of course, what Dineke talked about is in some sense quite a lot easier because everything's in nice, well-structured, well-described formats to begin with, whereas we're working with this wild text. But we've split it into 2 stages because we want to think that what we're doing may be usable by other people. So there's an idiosyncratic part of this, which means going from a version of Heath's material to consistent formats. And then there's a pipeline, which we, as I say, we think will be reusable, that takes you from the consistent formats to the web presentation. It says here that we're working from, the idiosyncratic part works with a retyped version of Heath's materials. This was a sad story. We'd hoped that we'd be able to basically get what we needed from OCR, but all those orthographic complexities that I talked about before turned out to be just impossible to manage with OCR. Superscript, subscripts, it was a nightmare. And in the end, it was easier to actually have it retyped. The kind of formats we're talking about using here, well, there's three sections here. There's the texts, there's the dictionary, there's the grammar. So the texts, we're using a format called XIGT, which is an XML annotated representation for the interlinear gloss text of the kind which we saw in Dineke's presentation. For the dictionary, we're using a format called LIFT, which is again an XML encoding, which is intended for interchange of data from one lexicon to another. It's a fairly flexible, fairly intuitive format. It's at least well structured, reasonably well described. Mapping it to other lexical formats should not be too big a problem if people need to do that. And the grammar things get a lot more complicated because, it's a complex text document, but we're basically working with TEI guidelines as far as possible and seeing how far that gets us. There's some real problems we've come up against in that, which I'm happy to answer questions about, but I'm just going to say they're there today. But I will just show you one example of how we're using the kind of resources that are in TEI to deal with our problems. So as I've already said, there's two orthographic systems for Noongar. There are some forms that are the same because they don't involve any of the sounds that are spelt differently in the systems. But for the ones where they do differ in the grammar, we're encoding both of them. And for that, we're using an element that's already defined by TEI, which is the choice element. And this is in standard TEI usage. This is what you use, for example, for textual variants, where there's different readings. But we're just repurposing that and saying, well, we'll put one form in here under what's listed as original and one that's listed as correction. So you can see the example here. It's easier to start with the practical community orthography where the sound is represented by NG and Heath represents it with a superscript G. So that's encoded up here and then that's the alternative. So we have both of them available for further processing. And I hasten to add that the fact that one's called original and one's called correction implies no value judgment, right? We just wanted to reuse this element because there are good validation procedures for TEI encoding, and it's stupid not to take advantage of that when you can. So these are the kind of TEI resources that we're trying to deploy. Okay, now I'm going to switch now and just show you a little bit of what we've got happening here. I'll also just put in the chat a link to at least some of what we've got online at the moment. This is a project in progress. Some of what I'm going to show you is not yet at the link that I've put in the chat. We're catching up slowly, but I hope at least you'll get a sense of what we're doing. So what we're looking at first is a section from the grammar. We've decided that it's important that people should be able to look at the original. So we've got links back to page scans if you want to look at those. And that's there for pretty much everything that we're working with so far. Not the texts I'll show you, not so much yet, but we're working on that. And you can see there are links. These are links within the grammar, but there are also links for Noongar forms, which take you out to the dictionary. And you can see here there's links to lots of text references, there's links to cross-references within the dictionary and so forth. I'll just follow one just for fun and then head back again. But you can see all of these links were generated automatically in our pipeline from the underlying encoding. Not all of them work yet because we don't have all the texts up at this stage. Most of the dictionary internal links should work. Okay. And also down here, we'll see there's a link to a text example, which supports the claim that there's a way of reduplicating this foot, this word for foot. So we can go there, and here we have the text, and this has, let me just switch my sound on. You should be able to hear this. Can somebody stick a thumb up if you can hear anything? Right. So that's the, to this stage, that's the only text for which we have the audio. As I said, this is partly to do with the problem of having to align the text, the audio with the texts. It's also partly a problem of actually getting all the audio. We're having a long negotiation with IATSIS, and there's no problem. It's just tracking stuff down and getting it to us is taking quite a while. Again, you can see there are links to sections of the grammar. So it says this is not in Heath's texts. We've added this. We've said, okay, so this is referred to by a section of the grammar, and it's not found. Okay, that one's not there. Maybe that one is. No. But you can track these back references. Now, I just want to also show you a couple more examples of the orthography choice. So here's a page from the dictionary. And as you can see, there's superscripts there, there's subscripts. So this is Heath's original orthography. And we've got a link here that says switch orthography. And there we go. No more subscripts, no more superscripts. If you're looking closely, there's R's that have been doubled and things like that. I'll go back. So that went from double R to a single R there. Now, and I'll just show you one other example of this from a grammar section. So again, this is in Heath's orthography, we've got superscripts, subscripts, and we can change the orthography on this also. So the way this is going to work is that when you're within one orthography, any link you follow will be to a page that's in that orthography. But on any page, you will be able to choose to change orthography, and then the links will take you in that world. We're actually creating duplicate universes here. We considered the possibility that we'd add some kind of variable that we passed in the calls that called up the next page, and that we thought that's just A, too difficult, and B, too easy to break when people, as Dineke pointed out, you want to be able to be used on a smartphone, and that's the kind of thing that I'd start to worry about working on a smartphone browser. So given that it's actually not a huge amount of material to store, we're creating parallel universes, and you can switch between them at any page. So that's what we've got at the moment. All of the dictionary is currently online. A small amount of the grammar and a selection of texts are online, and you can explore them from the link that I put in the chat. Okay, let me just get back to my slides. Just then to finish up, we're hoping that this kind of work will help build communities around language scholarship, around language endangerment, language documentation, and assist the communities of people who speak languages. So the kind of benefits we hope we're achieving are that if you want to access the material, all you need is an internet connection. You don't need to be in a capital city. You don't need to have $250 to spare. You can just log on and find this material and explore it. Particularly in this case, there's a big benefit. We think that people will be able to choose which orthography they use, makes it much simpler for the community members. And for everybody, the kind of interlinking, which is inherent in the nature of language description, is made easy to follow. all you're doing is following links. And that's, that's a language, a grammar that we're all familiar with nowadays. And this is a way that can be exploited in a really useful way for certain kinds of scholarship. And as I think Dineke already alluded to, books are linear. And this is a non-linear approach to the material. You can choose to go through this material in any way you want. You can follow any links you want and have the joy of ending up in somewhere completely unexpected and wonderful. Or you can take a very focused approach and you'll be able to find the material that you need. And we hope that this kind of greater ease of use will benefit all sorts of people, linguists and non-linguists. And as I want to keep emphasizing this, we see this really crucial aspect. The community members in this case will really benefit from this orthography choice possibility. So thank you very much. That's where I'll finish.
Thank you very much, Simon and Nick. That was a fantastic presentation too, and it opens up many questions. Some questions are coming through here that relate to earlier presentations, and maybe we can deal with them and address. Well, there could be any number of responses to these earlier questions and the later ones too. So in this time, in the last 10 or 15 minutes that we have, we can open up to a more general conversation to find the links and explore the issues that people consider most important, whether they be by chat or by raising one's hand or simply speaking in this forum that we have now. I would like to return to Antonella's question, which was posed earlier for Christopher and Hayden, if we can. Have you considered computing similarity, for example, using BERT paraphrase models between each storyteller's texts? Now, we sort of jump back into a different context, a different presentation, but it also opens the questions and the issues to a broader discussion. So if you are able to respond to that one.
Yeah, I think that's a question for me. Thank you. The short answer is no, not really. I am aware, I mean, I guess I'm not that familiar with BERT model, language models, and we've kind of come to looking at topic models through the literature that's sort of attempted to connect topic modeling with discourse analysis, which has, probably not, or as far as I've seen, not been drawing on the more recent deep learning models. But that said, it does sound like a good thing to try. And I'm aware there's work out this year on what I think the authors call contextualized topic models that combine, a BERT language model with topic modeling too, and they produce really, really good looking topics. So that would be something for us to try as well.
Well, it's a good question, and thank you for your response. Now, just dealing with the chat, as we should first before opening it up. Here there are two questions for Simon from Robert, and the first one is: 3 XML systems were mentioned for the 3 different parts: text, dictionary, and grammar. TEI can do all 3 of those things, I think. Was there any reason that it wasn't? Because that's the first part of the question. First question. Yeah.
Thanks, Robert. Okay, so to get to one issue there, I think that it would actually be quite difficult to do interlinear text in TEI. I think it would add quite a lot of complexity compared to something like XIGT. I haven't actually tried to do it, but maybe I should at some point. Yeah. In terms of dictionary, we did look at TEI dictionary lexicon stuff, and the reason that we didn't go with that is because LIFT originally was an SIL initiative, and it fits quite closely with Flex and shoebox approaches to lexica. And we thought that for most linguists, that would be, for field linguists, that was a more familiar approach than what was offered by TEI. I think that the kind of underlying thrust of your question, could it all be unified in TEI, is a really interesting one and worth pursuing. And when we actually get to the stage where we've got everything up and running, maybe I'll have time to think about that. I should probably mention that Nick and I have been working on this for a decade now, but we've never had funding. We've never really had much time to devote to it. And the second part of your question about whether we think the pipeline...
So I'll just read it. Could Simon talk about whether the pipeline they've developed is usable by others who are trying to solve similar problems?
We certainly hope that that will be the case, yes. We hope that we can offer some kind of a model that people will know if they can get their data into certain formats, then it won't be a problem to have the kind of web presentation we're developing.
And could I just comment, and in the context of Matt Gold's keynote presentation earlier today, the fact of working on this for 10 years, as many people and others have been doing, similar long-term work, this idea of the sort of slow but valuable movement of research over time, rather than something that's just funded for a quick, moment and then it disappears, I think is extremely valuable and insightful. And I congratulate you on all of that work. We have another question that's coming through in the chat from Hunter here. Question for both Dineke and Simon. Creating e-reference grammars can be very time consuming. Have you found that professional structures such as promotion reward this work, important work, or do they push you away from this work towards more articles? If they don't support it, how have you negotiated this tension doing the important work that promotion panels may not reward? This is a very important, timely comment for lots of us. Who would like to answer that? So this is, well, maybe you could both have a go, or just some short comments from the two of you, but we could also open this up more generally to a discussion if that was helpful. It's certainly a big issue.
I'll jump in, let Dineke collect thoughts maybe. My attitude to these questions maybe is partly indicated by the fact that I started my full-time academic career at level B and I finished my full-time academic career at level B. So I think I was more interested in what I was interested in than in getting promoted. But I think, and Dineke may want to agree or disagree with this, but I think that in terms of the way field linguists and documentary linguists currently work, if we set up the right kind of pipelines and the right kinds of formats, then actually producing an e-reference grammar will be easier than producing a written grammar. And if it's done properly, it should be also that the e-version can be easily turned into a printed version. I think that if the technology is worked out properly, then actually you'll get a lot of bang for your buck.
Yes, yes, thank you, Simon. I would absolutely agree with that. It's talking about slow processes. I think putting together a reference grammar is inherently a very slow process. And I think one of the really nice things of an e-grammar, for instance, is also that, well, I have to say this, like, this is not a PhD project or something for me. Like there is no degree or anything that is dependent on this, which is like for a lot of grammars, of course, I've written like as PhD projects, so it's a little bit different for them. But for me, it would be like I would feel much more confident to sort of do this in like a bit by bit kind of thing as an e-resource rather than, you know, because when you want to publish something as a book, it sort of needs to like really, you know, finished and really like a highly polished version of something. So I think it will, yeah, it will actually lower, like if like Simon is saying, if we can make it so that these things are set up properly, it can sort of really lower the barrier, I feel, hopefully for people to get stuff out there, because I know like a lot of, especially also with like dictionary stuff and corpora, like people are just sort of yeah, it just takes such a long time at the moment to sort of get stuff out there because we have all these barriers to getting stuff published. Yeah, what that means in the end for promotion, like probably I'm also not in a position to really say anything about. I do really feel that there is sort of slowly, like there is a little bit of a turnaround where nowadays I think these kinds of like what are they called non-traditional research outputs are getting like being more valued. And yeah, I would just hope that that will continue. But I also don't have any sort of personal experiences to share, as I have not applied for promotion in my life at all yet. So yeah, that would be my contribution. I hope that this resonates also with people in other fields, maybe, because I don't think this is restricted to linguistics only.
And if I can add another comment, I think that probably the more crucial question, at least for people doing the kind of work that Dineke is doing, is proper recognition of the corpus building aspect of their work, because that's incredibly demanding intellectual work. If anybody doubts me, please come and talk to me and I'll give you examples of what it's like to actually do this. It's so difficult, but it's not regarded as a research output. I'm sure that's the case in other fields as well, that there are similar problems, but it's for linguists, it's a really acute problem.
Yeah, this whole question about the sort of assemblage of data or the compilation of material across different fields not being regarded as a legitimate research resource, activity, and because it, that the systems preclude that, is, I think, does feature across many different fields, and we probably all see that in different ways. And some of the most valuable work, I have to say personally, that I've ever done, I think, at least the stuff that I enjoyed the most, wasn't counted, and it's edited work. It's sort of, working with people, communities of practice to follow up on particular topical issues. But if it doesn't fit in the mold, then it can't be counted. But nevertheless, we can be proud of all of this work. I'm looking at the time. So as the chair, I've got 1 minute left to call for your questions, and also to remind the audience that there is a social event running at 6 p.m. New Zealand time. So that's about 30 minutes on the theme of Australasian DH law. And this is where people are bringing along anecdotes or origin stories of the earliest experience with what's called Digital Humanities now, and being a part of a conversation about the ever-expanding fabric of our Asia-Pacific community. I encourage you to attend that. But if there's one last question or comment, then let's take that now before we finish our session, and thank everybody.
Could I ask Chris and Hayden a question quickly?
Yeah, sure.
Looking at your topic 8 looked like it was kind of fillers. Yeah, so, and the change in time over that, does that indicate that the second group of narratives were less fluent than the first group?
So remind me, in QB2, it's quite a bit more right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think part of this is because of the kind of more interactional environment that was collected in QB1. There was no one sitting in the room with them. And so they were literally just talking to a camera. But in QB2, there was an interviewer on the kind of behind the camera who I think a lot of the storytellers were talking to. And I think we think that the reason for more fillers might partly be due to that kind of more interactional environment. But in saying that, I think there's still more room to explore there. I think the presence of fillers could indicate other kind of factors of difficulty in recalling something, or perhaps talking about delicate situations.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for your contributions, for the paper presenters collectively, and for the audience, and for our discussion. Let's finish this session now. I've been pleased to chair the session. I've been speaking to you here on the land of the Whadjuk Noongar people. I acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land and their elders, past, present, and emerging. Thank you for all of your contributions, and enjoy the rest of the conference. If you can be part of the upcoming social session in half an hour, please do participate in it. Thank you to all.